organizations started to form, so that collectively, rather than just one person going and fight for their rights to be able to borrow from the bank, or fight for their rights to be able to attend school, or fight for their rights to, accomplish those things that they should have been allowed to accomplish after they were free. They bonded together under these organizations, under these NGO. I've heard about ACTA's been around for a while. And once they bonded together, then they were able to go. They had educated people who were educated during the time of slavery, who were allowed to be house slave, allowed to read books, allowed to understand the things that the slave master knew. And that's how they were able to come and bond together and then form solutions to their problem, or find intellectual ways, or find better method of solving their problems as a group. I think those factors force them now, and then they go and they seek a resolution to the problems they were facing. And from that time to now, these organizations has been working tirelessly to advance the rights of Afro-Guyanese. And even today, we have those organizations working tirelessly to advance the rights. So we have a lot of social organizations, a lot of organizations that looks into the interests of a political agenda or a financial agenda. They advance a lot of the agenda of Afro-Guyanese. I think those are the main factors to me that force the formation of these groups or organizations. It motivated those Africans, the Afro-Guyanese that is, to bond together, to collectively fight for their rights. And I think although that was birthed in trade unions, that's one of a form of NGO that collectively fight for the rights of employees. There are several of them, but to me, it's the conditions, the discrimination, the harsh working conditions that force them to form these organizations.
Absolutely, some very good NGOs there that fight and stand up for the rights of people who have oftentimes been neglected by governments. And so we are speaking today about the importance of NGOs, effective NGOs. We know there are quite a few in Guyana. Um, Mr. Granger and Shalon Washington mentioned AGDA, and there were others that were very active, ASCRIA during the 70s, maybe 80s, and so forth. But what we know about in modern times, and there's still lots of NGOs, African NGOs in the villages like Kildone and Nurney, and then they have also Leeds Village, and they have lots of others in villages, I am sure, Myconi, and those places. But let's get back to responding to this. What factors and forces motivate the formation? Mr. Granger touched on that. Ms. Washington touched on that. And Mr. Wayne Caesar will touch on it now. Sir?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. After emancipation, once the slaves would have emancipated themselves from being enslaved, right? They didn't all left the plantation. They were, they went out and they started purchasing their villages, which of course that's gonna be a whole different topic, a part of the village movement. But they were still on the plantations. They were negotiating better pay from, the Europeans. And listen, it was a situation where they had gotten their emancipation and they were basically out there on their own. So I think in trying to figure out where they go from there, because after emancipation, they would have gotten a taste of what liberty is really like, you know? So in order to really get the full scope of what liberty is all about, there would have to be some advancement. And Shalon touched on advancement. So, in order to get that advancement, and these were people who, to an extent, had a perspective that was all in the same mold, right? So, their perspectives were not that diverse, but their goal was common. And that was, to advance their cause as Africans. okay, because we know that they would have been marginalized. We know that they would not have been treated equally. Okay, we know that they would have fought for emancipation, and we know once that would have happened, it would have left a better taste in the mouths of the Europeans, right? And that would have also started the importation of the Indians into Guyana also. So that threw a whole complexity into the whole thing of Africans being able to advance, because once you started getting the Indians into Guyana, no one was paying too much attention to the Africans. So I think that that is what led to, to them, forming these NGOs and joining under the NGO umbrella to get that protection, to be able to fight for their own causes, the right to be a part of economic advancement in Guyana, the right to be able to maintain their own villages, the right to, drainage and irrigation in their villages, because their villages were flooded at times, and they would have lost, crops, they would have lost, you know animals, these things would have happened to them. So I think, these type of issues that they would have encountered after being emancipated would have led to them joining, and even in some instances forming their own NGOs to kind of provide that umbrella of protection for their people. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Wayne Caesar. Well said, well covered. All three of our guests, or my co host, I should say, were able to cover aspects of the first question, which what factors and forces motivate the formation of African Guyanese NGO organizations? And this leads us to the second question, and we pose this to Mr. Granger first. How have African Guyanese NGO contributed to society for over 180 years? Mr. Granger?
Thank you, Mark. Well, I go forward to go back, or I go back to go forward, because both Shalon and Wayne mentioned an important element in the formation of non-governmental organizations, not only for African Guyanese, but also for Portuguese, Chinese, and Indians, because by the end of the 19th century and the early years, the first quarter of the 20th century, every ethnic group realized it had to fight the white person, the British colonial authorities. So discrimination was a factor. And the Portuguese set up, they had their own paper, they had their own church, the Roman Catholic Church. They had a paper actually printed in Portuguese called O Português. More than one paper, written in Portuguese, of course, for the Portuguese community. And they had their own clubs, exclusive clubs. Similarly, the Chinese set up the Chinese Association. I think it's still located in Brickdam. And many other Chinese started to come into the country, and they would go to the Chinese Association, which was a non-governmental organization which looked after the interests of Chinese. And the British Guyanese Indian Association set up their own organization. Right now in Thomas Lands, there's something called, it used to be called the BGEICC, the British Guyanese Indian Cricket Club. Now it's called Everest, because there was a time in Guyana when people felt that by getting rid of the names, ethnic names, you get rid of ethnic problem or ethnic conflict. So there used to be one again in Thomas Lands, and it was changed to Cosmos Sports Club, but that was originally Chinese Sports Club. And the East Indian Sports Club was changed to Everest Sports Club. Of course, the point is that colonial government was so oppressive to all non-British people that each group had to form its own non-governmental organizations to look after the interests of their specific groups. So Chinese, Portuguese, African, Indian set up their own organization. So the NGOs was not exclusively African. And again, these organizations were not initially meant to be confrontational or divisive, but they were meant to be representative of those groups. So it is not as though the Africans were trying to break away. Africans looking after their self-interest. Indians were looking after their self-interest. Chinese were looking after self-interest. Portuguese looking after self-interest. So in this way, I would say that the African uh, non-governmental organizations, which were the first to be established, the first to publish their own paper, the Fremont Sentinel, uh, created a model for the Portuguese, Indians, and Chinese to because there was no governmental system which embraced the particular interests of every group. And later on, these contributed, strangely enough, or paradoxically, I would say, to bringing these subject peoples together. So you find that the first president of the BGTUC, the Trade Union Council, was Chinese. You know, so although the bulk of workers were African, the first, president of the TUC was Chinese. So they were able to come together because they had a shared, they were suffering similarly, I don't want to say equally, on the British colonial government. So I would say the African Guyanese NGO pioneered the representation of the interests of the ethnic groups, not in a confrontational way, but to ensure that the rights and freedoms were enjoyed by all. And I think when you see how the BGLU was formed, for example, although it represented African dock workers, Steve Lewis first, it led to the formation and it helped the formation of non-African unions. Of course, after the BGLU, you had things like the Manpower Citizens Association. And when the Guyana, what is now GAWU, the parent of GAWU is GIW, which is formed by Joseph Lachman Singh, who was the first elected chairman of the PNC. So you see, racial hostility is not embedded in Guyana. The first chairman of the PNC was Joseph Lachman Singh, and the first general secretary of GIW at the time of the Enmore shooting was a woman called Jane Phillips Gay, an African Guyanese woman. So you can see the type of society we came from was more cohesive, more harmonious, and people are now trying to divide it. So the contribution African NGOs made was to create a level of consciousness, not against one another, but against the British. And I think that is outstanding. And we see that it permeated not only labor, but also sports and culture until there were some divisive factors in political evolution. But the NGOs contributed to what I would call Guyanese-ness. And people, regardless of the ethnic origin, felt proud to be Guyanese. That's my view.
Thank you so much, President Granger, talking about the Guyanese-ness from the NGOs and spoke about the uh, BGLU, the British Guiana Labor Union, and stemmed out of that, there were other NGOs. Speaking of the Enmore Martyrs and the formation of the GAU, Guyana Agricultural Workers Union, some very important points made there, things that I probably have missed at some point in time as to who actually started that and who was the first chairman also of the People's National Congress. Lots and lots of things indeed that we are going to walk away with from today's program. Let me welcome all of you, our listeners from around Guyana, wherever you are. Welcome to this program. It's Anansi Web Education. As we continue here on the second topic, Ms. Shellen Washington will take a shot at that. How have African Guyanese NGO contributed to society for over 180 years. Miss Washington.
I think after listening to Mr. Granger, it's difficult to put more. Um, it's difficult to shed more light into that situation because one of the things is the Afro-Guyanese NGO has made such a dramatic impact on our society that it has also influenced, based on what President Granger said earlier, it had influenced other ethnic groups to follow suit and to form their own organization to advance the interests of those people. And I believe even today we could see the remnants of those organizations. We could see the imprint that they've left behind because even today we still continue to have these organizations, even though we don't have as harsh working conditions as we had back then. And even though, we could say discrimination has continued, but not at the level it was during colonialism, these organizations are still actively alive, advancing the causes of Afro Guyanese people, and not just Afro Guyanese, like you heard earlier, but advancing the interests of all other ethnic groups, because there's certain other organizations that are not just restricted, but it's just that the impact that the Afro Guyanese NGO has had on our society, that it has caused the establishment of other non-NGO that not only is advances the right of Afro-Guyanese, but it advances the rights of Guyanese as a whole. So now through our NGO, that's the only lens we can really look at and say, well, we have a one Guyana. We cannot say that as it relates to the government, but under the eyes of the NGO, who tries in many ways, some of these organizations, just to advance the rights of our people generally. And I think the Afro-Guyanese NGO has had such a lasting impact because of the work that is done in the past. It has contributed tremendously towards advancing racial integration, towards advancing proper working conditions in Guyana, towards advancing our rights as a people in the government in Guyana. Had the impact of colonialism remained, those organizations would have still been working tirelessly to ensure that there was integration. I think to some extent, to a limited extent, we were able through those organizations to accomplish integration. And even today, in this century, where we would believe that that should have been something that we should have conquered, we still haven't been able to conquer it, especially under the government that we have, who have practices of discriminatory practices against the masses in Guyana. The policies are not policies that are suitable for all Guyanese, but they are restricted to one particular group to the exclusion of the other. And I think as long as we continue to have this type of policies, it will be a situation where these NGOs will have to continue to work to advance the causes and the rights of Afro-Guyanese, of the people of Guyana generally, of people who are not necessarily a part of one political group. As you heard earlier, we do have organizations that are involved in politics that are also there are also non-governmental organizations. So they're all bonded together and they have this lasting impact. So as long as discrimination remains, as long as there's this disparity with the way our masses are treated, the people are treated, the impact of these organizations will have to continue to advance the rights of all Guyanese, especially Afro-Guyanese people.
Thank you so much, Miss Washington, attorney at law. You guys probably would have taken a lot out of what Wayne had in mind to say as well about the subject matter, because it has done the same to me. Not much could be added on my part, but the listening to Mr. Granger and Miss Washington, the importance of NGOs, and of course the contributions made by our African Guyanese in this over the past 180 years. Tremendous contributions were made, and I'm glad that we were able to talk about it today. Mr. Wayne Caesar, public accountant, will take a bite at this here now. Same question, concerning how have African Guyanese NGO contributed to society for over 180 years.
You
Mr.
know, Mark, you would have hit it right on the head with what His Excellency and Shalon would have had to say concerning that particular question. I think they've touched upon just about everything. But one thing I would like to add, and I think Shalon was heading down that road, is that, in the current situation that we're in Guyana, we would like to see those NGOs, the ones that are still in existence, actually rise and come to the forefront because they are needed at this time, especially when we look at, the rising cost of living when it comes to food, amongst other things. We need to start looking back again at, probably bringing back our co-ops, these places that you could have gone and gotten food, sugar, rice, salt, butter, all these little things at a better price than the market price. Because listen, we don't have jobs. That's an issue. And when people don't have jobs, when there's not enough employment out there, there is not a lot of disposable income to spend on food. So I think, the co-op is an NGO that we can look at reviving again and bringing back, just based on the poverty that our people in Guyana is still facing, although we are producing oil. And, these are things that we need to look at. And listen, NGOs over the time of history has done a lot for all six ethnic groups. As Shalon and His Excellency would have said, they would have brought their concerns to the table. They would have let the concerns of these ethnic groups being addressed. Outside of having that NGO, that concern may have never been addressed. And the difference between NGOs and government is that, you don't have to go through parliament and have all this political fighting to get something, across the table passed. It's a group of people who get together, and put their intelligence together and were able to move things forward. So I really like the idea of NGOs, and I think we need to bring them back to the forefront. I think they would make a tremendous push for our country. And Mr. Granger does hit on something quite often: social cohesion. That's something that we really need to consider, and we probably should have an NGO in place that just focuses on that specific issue. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Mr. Caesar. All three of our participants contributed their opinions on this matter, and I'm sure many of you out there in the audience would have your opinions as well, and your knowledge and experience on the NGOs across Guyana, and hence the question: how have African Guyanese NGO contributed to society for over 180 years? And maybe there should be a book about NGOs and the formation and genesis and so forth. But our contributors have been able to enlighten us in so many ways and examples. This leads to the final question here. Why has the government, and this is important, of course, especially with what's happening now, many see it as a disrespect, but the question is here: why has the government established the so-called Association of People of African Descent? It's called APAD. Mr. David Granger, your take, please.
In short, I think it's an insult to the intelligence of the Guyanese people. It's a contradiction in terms for a government to set up a non-governmental organization, especially targeting one community which has a record, a proven record of over 180 years of running their own affairs, running their own non-governmental organizations. I mean, is the government going to set up an association of people of Indian origin? Is it going to set up an association of people of Chinese origin? It's rude. It's impudent. It's difficult to understand the thinking that behind the government decision to set up APAD, targeting one group and undermining a community with dozens of non-governmental organizations. I can't say more, but it is really quite stupid and insultive to our people, to our people's intelligence. That's all I can say. I don't want to say more. Very frankly.
Thank you so much. Quite silly, quite stupid indeed, disrespectful. Um, Mr. Wayne Caesar, we have touched on this on numerous occasions, and here's another opportunity to take a shot at it. Why has the government established the so-called Association of People of African Descent, APAD? A disrespect and very stupid. Your take, Mr. Caesar.
So, first of all, Mark, I agree with what you just said, and I agree with every single thing that was just, uttered by His Excellency. Listen, this is high class, high pass. Now, if you want to create such an organization, Mark, I am telling you this. I believe that I'm smart. As a smart person, you know your position as a government. You know what the people are thinking of you. You know even what some in the international community is thinking of you. You cannot independently form such an organization. And like His Excellency would have said, that is a disrespect to many of the other NGOs that we already have in place, IPADG amongst others that the government is even unwilling to, fund, right? The other thing with this is that, listen, you're going to form an an association that, is tying to Africans. What do? You go up the ladder. You can reach out to people like, for example, His Excellency and ask him, hey, we are trying to put together this, and do you have individuals that you would like to be on this board? You cannot do something like this without consulting the opposition, a party that is so overloaded with African-based individuals. Okay, and like His Excellency would have said, a government cannot form such an organization. It looks very funny. It looks like if they're trying to target our communities because right now they're not getting our votes. This looks like a whole political thing here. This doesn't look like, no kind of NGO. This look like a PPPC strategy, Mark. And it's not going to work because it's not going to be recognized. If you are not consulting, listen, Guyana is supposedly supposed to be a democracy. If you are not consulting the opposition, but you are going to create such an organization, it is unacceptable. Mark.
Thank you so much. Unacceptable. It's not what the people want, but it's not surprising what the regime has done. And the name is quite fitting. Apaja. Apad. Quite close to something. That's a Apaja. That's what it is. Miss Washington, as we close off today's program, why has, in your opinion, I know we have dealt with this before, but why has the government established the so-called Association of People of African Descent, and they're calling it APAD?
I believe one of the first things we overlooked in this situation is that those organizations are called NGO, and that's for a reason. It's called non-governmental, meaning the government has no hands in that. It doesn't belong to the government. It has no association with the government, but it's independent of the government interference or meddling for a purpose. Okay, so that is the first problem here with the government agreeing to form such an organization. And then the second thing is we understand that the government likes to be in control of everything. even they want to be in control of all the races, all the people, and they want to be able to control Afro-Guyanese people. And we know the Afro-Guyanese people are very resilient, and it's difficult. They have a mind of their own. They like to think for themselves. They like to act for themselves. So when the government is going to get involved in something that they have no business in, that by its very nature call it a non-governmental organization, and then to have the audacity to name it and to form it and to assign persons that they would like to lead those organizations, that's a grave disrespect in our community. It's a slap in every single Afro-Guyanese face, and they're telling us clearly that they do not agree with us wanting to take our own interests under our own control. So they want a saying in how our interest is dealt with, how we deal with issues. But I would advise every single Guyanese not to get involved in any organization, every single Afro-Guyanese, not to get involved in APAD or APAD, whatever the Guyana government would call it, because we already have several NGO, Afro-Guyanese NGO, that already looks into the interests of Afro-Guyanese people. So the government of Guyana should not have gotten involved in this. There was no need, no requirement for them to go establish another NGO when by its very nature, it's called a non-governmental organization, meaning the government has no hands in it. The government needs to take its hands out of that and allow the Afro-Guyanese people to deal with their issues the way they've been dealing with it for over 180 plus years.
Thank you so much, Ms. Washington. Thank you so much, Mr. Granger. Thank you so much, Mr. Wayne Caesar. And thank you so much to all of our listeners who have taken the time out to tune in to us today for yet another interesting program on Anansi Web Education, of which we dealt with 3 topics today: what factors and forces motivate the formation of African Guyanese NGO organizations, how have African Guyanese NGO contributed to society for over 180 years, why has the government established the so-called Association of People of African Descent, APAD? APAD. Not sure why, but I'm glad that our guests this morning, our contributors this morning, were able to cover all 3 of those questions. And especially the last one caught my attention. I know it has gotten your attention out there as well. And a lot of you see it as disrespect. You see it as I pass. But we're seeing a lot of that these days. What these sort of programs do is able to open your eyes on what's happening, and also to take you back from where it all started with regards to developments, especially throughout the African Guyanese communities, the villages, and so forth. Mr. Granger, thank you so much. As always, Mr. Caesar, same to you, and Ms. Washington, thank you as well.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And good night to all the listeners.
Yes, good night to all of you indeed.
Good night, everyone.
God bless.